Hey guys, Luca here. Thanks for jumping into another video. Today we're diving into the Bitcoin dominance chart to see what it's telling us about risk appetite, Ethereum's comeback, and whether an alt season will finally come in 2025. So grab a coffee, hit the like button, and let's dive in. Moving to the Bitcoin dominance, when we talk about it, we want to understand the story tells about risk appetite, because the Bitcoin dominance shows us where liquidity is flowing. Therefore, if the Bitcoin dominance is going higher, it signals that liquidity is still flowing into the traditional and safer assets. And I've made this argument a bunch of times in the past, where I said that throughout 2023 and all throughout 2024, each time the Bitcoin dominance went lower, there were a lot of people who were screaming for an alt season and for the Bitcoin dominance to finally go down. But what they fail to understand is that a durable drop in the Bitcoin dominance is what often coincides with a cycle top formation. Because, and this is where it gets really interesting, the Bitcoin dominance actually tells a very important story about risk appetite. When the Bitcoin dominance is going higher, it signals that there's a smaller risk appetite in the markets that investors have, therefore the Bitcoin dominance is going higher. However, when the Bitcoin dominance is going lower, like we've seen back in November or back in December of 2024, right where we had that midterm distribution phase, that's what tells us that the risk appetite is very high. Therefore, that is a good place to de-risk. What we want to understand is the fact that the risk appetite of investors is what drives these market cycles. When the risk appetite is somewhat low, and investors take the risk of actually investing, but not investing in risk assets, that's what drives a healthy bull market. And this is what I think we've seen over the last couple of years as the Bitcoin dominance kept on going higher. However, when the risk appetite is getting too high, the Bitcoin dominance starts going lower. Therefore, that is a place that can coincide with a distribution phase and a macro top formation, because market makers use the very high risk appetite of retail investors to distribute and to have a strong counterparty. So we've seen this happening in prior cycles back in 2021, for example, or back in 2017. So if you correlate this with the price action of Bitcoin, we have a very interesting finding. Back in 2017, when Bitcoin was topping out, the Bitcoin dominance went lower. And you might say that the Bitcoin dominance went lower here and it crashed and the price kept on going higher. Here there were like 3 coins in the whole crypto market. So I'm not using this as a confluence. I'm using what happened after December of 2017, when a lot of other altcoins came into the market. This is where we've seen the biggest alt season and altcoins massively outperforming. So there was a lot of euphoria around it. A lot of people at the time were hoping that they found the new Bitcoin. Unfortunately, and this is an important takeaway and an important lesson, there's only one Bitcoin, and that is the king of the whole crypto market. There will never be a second Bitcoin, no matter what the narratives say, no matter how much risk is in the markets, no matter how good an altcoin might perform, there will never be a second Bitcoin, and that is just an objective fact. So at the time, a lot of people were screaming for the second Bitcoin to emerge. They were hoping that they got the second Bitcoin before it became mainstream. That is what we've seen. Back in 2021, when we had this distribution phase, we see here this range that developed over 3 months before we eventually had this major drop in the summer of 2021, and eventually it reversed, and then we entered the bear market. What preceded all of this was, in fact, the distribution phase, which led to this major alt season. Now, back in 2021, that alt season was mainly driven by the macroeconomic environment. So we all know that back in 2021, we were in a full quantitative easing environment where the Fed was injecting and blasting liquidity in the financial system, which of course led to a higher degree of risk appetite. And investors also having liquidity to invest in these very risky and volatile assets, which are altcoins. So the main point that I'm trying to make here with all of these explanations and narratives that we've seen throughout the years is that when we approach a certain phase in the bull market, when we approach especially these phases where the risk appetite is very high, we oftentimes have a very strong narrative that fuels the euphoria of investors and that also fuels the risk appetite of investors. Now, once again, it all comes down to liquidity, and it all comes down to market makers having liquidity to distribute at the top. Now, what we've seen here throughout this bull market is the Bitcoin dominance going higher. A lot of investors hoping that altcoins will outperform Bitcoin in a bull market, because they have done so back in 2021 when we see here this major drop in the Bitcoin dominance, but they have failed to understand that the whole macroeconomic environment and what actually led to this alt season back in 2021 was in fact the macroeconomic environment. which now is completely different than the one it has been back in 2021. Over the last couple of years, instead of being in a quantitative easing environment where liquidity gets injected in the financial system, we have been in a quantitative tightening environment, which primes traditional assets over the risky and volatile assets. So let's now move on to a pair to show you the exact correlation I'm talking about. Moving to the total 3 and Bitcoin pair, what we see here is how altcoins have performed over the last couple of years against Bitcoin. Back in 2021, when the Fed was implementing their quantitative easing measures and was blasting liquidity in the financial system, we see here reflected in their total assets, which were growing at the time. This is where altcoins were outperforming Bitcoin because these risk assets need cheap liquidity and low interest rates in order to rally. And we've seen this reflected also in the IWM to SPX pair, which shows us how small caps perform against the traditional equities in the S&P 500. So this concept applies at a very broad scale, and it shows us how risk assets are performing against the traditional and safer assets. And we can correlate this with the macroeconomic environment in order to determine the risk appetite of investors. So we see here that altcoins have massively underperformed over the last couple of years because we have been in a quantitative tightening environment. Essentially, since the Fed has stepped away from their quantitative easing measures, and then back in 2022, when they eventually declared that they were transitioning into a quantitative tightening environment. Therefore, risk assets suffered against the traditional and safer assets as reflected here. But one of the main things I have been thinking over the last couple of weeks, as I've explained in many of my prior updates and videos, is that if quantitative tightening is what led to this underperformance of altcoins against Bitcoin, when it will eventually end, well, that's what I think could lead to macro catalyst that could change this underperformance and could lead to an alt season. Now, this would be also very interesting because if we have the end of quantitative tightening and the Fed finally stepping away from their quantitative tightening measures, that I think could lead to a lot of euphoria in the markets. And that will most likely lead to a higher degree of risk appetite, which is exactly what leads to an alt season in the first place and what leads to distribution from Bitcoin towards risk investments. When an alt season comes, when altcoins start to outperform Bitcoin, that is a warning signal. That is not something positive for the markets because it signals that we're in the last phase of the bull market when risk assets finally outperform the traditional assets. And also, as I explained earlier regarding a very strong narrative, back in 2017, we had a ton of people screaming that they found the next Bitcoin. Back in 2021, we had people buying every altcoin because they had the money to do so. Now, I think our next narrative will be around the end of quantitative tightening, potential soft landing, and upcoming rate cuts. That would normally push the prices of risk assets and equities much, much higher. But the markets would have already priced in that. And at that time, I expect the top to already be in here. When the euphoria is at its peak, that is when the markets eventually roll over. And that is when the real economic downturn hits. And I've made a post on this back in March where I said that we'll have one final leg up in the markets fueled by euphoria and by positive narratives. And that is when the real economic downturn eventually hits. Now remember, back in March, everyone was screaming for a recession. Everyone was saying that a bear market was next. Everyone was saying that buying at those levels was a stupid idea. And now I'm publicly saying that all the risk in the coming weeks because I expect that we'll have an economic downturn after this. And that we'll have the bear market that everyone expected when we were at the range lows. Now, returning to the Bitcoin dominance, what we've seen throughout 2023 and throughout 2024 was a lot of people screaming for an alt season. But now, after they have held these altcoins, which have mostly underperformed against Bitcoin. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There are some altcoins that have outperformed Bitcoin throughout this bull market, but cherry picking the exact altcoin that would outperform it is almost impossible. And that's why I think that altcoins represent short-term opportunities to make money, but do not represent long-term reliable investments. Now, a lot of people hope to buy altcoins and then hold them for 1 to 2 years, then 10 to 15x their money. But that's just not how this works. I believe that there are certain periods where we can make money with these altcoins, like back in November or December. So there are these short periods of irrationality that lead up to massive profits. But we also must pay attention because they are very short dated, like we've seen back in 2021. This alt season has lasted about 4 months until eventually topping out, and then we basically entered the bear market. Back in 2017, this alt season has lasted, well, about 42 days. That's how much altcoins have outperformed Bitcoin durably. Here we had a period of essentially 3 years where the Bitcoin dominance went higher as altcoins underperformed Bitcoin. So altcoins outperform Bitcoin for a very short period of time before they eventually bleed back to the king. So that's important to note, because if we want to make money by buying altcoins, we must pay attention and we must never round trip the gains. A lot of people do that. A lot of people rotate the gains from one altcoin to another just to round trip all of the profits that they made. So keeping your emotions in check and assuring that you're not greedy by chasing higher prices is one of the most important steps in making money by buying altcoins. Now, adding the bull market support band, we see that over the last couple of years, the Bitcoin dominance has tested the bull market support band multiple times and then bounced off of it. So I think that as long as the bull market support band still acts as a support and the Bitcoin dominance doesn't fall below it, we're still pretty much in safe territories, because it signals that the risk appetite isn't sufficiently high to lead to a distribution phase in the markets. Now, that's how I've used the Bitcoin dominance multiple times. And this is also what gave me the confidence to accumulate back in March and early April, when everyone was panicking. The Bitcoin dominance going higher, the Bitcoin dominance forming new highs, suggesting that that wasn't a distribution phase, and that the most likely outcome from Bitcoin moving from then on was to go higher and to have another leg up, which would eventually lead to this period of euphoria where market makers would distribute. So once again, I think that we can use the Bitcoin dominance both as a way to assess the broader cycle and as a way to understand when altcoins will finally outperform, so we can position ourselves accordingly. Now, looking at the altcoin season index, we see that we're currently deep in Bitcoin season territories as Bitcoin is outperforming. When altcoins will eventually outperform, as we see here, the last two times it has outperformed, and when we entered alt season territories, which is above 75, that has coincided with either a local top, as we see here in January of 2024, or with a macro top, as we see in March of 2024, and later on in December of 2024. So this is how I think we can use the correlation between altcoins and Bitcoin. And I believe that in the next couple of months, we'll finally enter a period of risk on, where altcoins will outperform, when the Bitcoin dominance will go down, as we also approach a very important resistance level, which is the 0.786 Fibonacci retracement level. I expect that once we reach this level, we'll finally have something similar to this, and eventually the Bitcoin dominance will roll over. Because, as we see here in the past, each time a Fibonacci level gets tested, the Bitcoin dominance then breaks above it, then it consolidates, then we once again tap into the next Fibonacci level, and we've seen this all throughout 2023, all throughout 2024, but the 0.786 Fibonacci level is the last important Fibonacci level. Therefore, I think we could finally have the top in the Bitcoin dominance forming. But once again, I don't think we can exactly time this. There are some key narratives that we can tie ourselves to, which is the end of quantitative tightening, that will lead to this risk on period in the markets. But I don't think we can really time this. We cannot time an alt season, or we cannot time when we'll finally have this correction in the Bitcoin dominance. But the only thing we can do is hope that it will come later, because the later it comes, the higher the price of Bitcoin will be. Therefore, I'll continue tracking this. I don't want to make any predictions on when we'll have an alt season, but what I want to say is that I'll use the Bitcoin dominance to assess the broader market, and when we'll eventually have this rollover in the Bitcoin dominance, whether it's from these levels, that's when I'll start becoming more cautious regarding the high time frame trend and the bull market that we have been in over the past few months. With that being said, this is my detective work on the Bitcoin dominance and what a real alt season setup looks like. If this video helped to bring some clarity, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss out on future updates like this. Also, make sure to stay tuned for one of my most important upcoming videos regarding Ethereum and how I'm positioned on Ethereum in the next couple of weeks, how I've accumulated and what my strategy has been, so you can understand what my strategy will be. With that being said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.